Chapter 1 Awakening by the Nile. Now I will tell you the history of ancient Egypt, which began thousands of years ago on the banks of the Nile River, as if you were living there yourself. When I opened my eyes, the darkness had not yet fully faded. The coolness of the night still remained inside the mud brick walls. The flat roof of our house felt like stone that had grown cold throughout the night. When I breathed in, I could smell both river water and earth in the air, the scent of wet mud mixed with dry straw. In the distance, a thin mist rose from the surface of the Nile and shimmered like silver in the first light of morning. When I listened carefully, the sounds arrived slowly. First, the rustling of the reeds, then the occasional call of birds, then the restless movement of a donkey, a goat, and beneath all of it, very deep and steady, the sound of the Nile flowed, as if it was not water that moved, but time itself. I was living there, on the eastern bank of the Nile, in a village where low mud brick houses stood close to one another. The walls of our homes were made of sun-dried clay. When I ran my fingers across them, the surface felt rough. The coolness of the night hid inside the small cracks. During the day, these walls held the heat. At night, they protected us from the cold. There were not many possessions inside our home. A few baskets, clay jars, woven mats on the floor, and a small oil lamp in the corner. The smoke of the lamp had left a thin, dark stain on the ceiling. I could not count how many nights had passed by looking at that mark. My mother always woke before me. She rose with quiet steps. She filled one of the clay jars with water and prepared barley bread. The bread was always hard, but its smell felt warm and comforting. When I stepped outside, the sun had not yet risen. The sky stood between pale blue and deep purple. On the horizon toward the desert, the sand dunes stretched like pale ghosts. As I walked toward the Nile, I felt the coolness rising from the ground beneath the soles of my feet. I walked barefoot. Sometimes the mud slipped between my toes. It was cold, but I was used to it. The Nile looked different every morning. Sometimes it was calm. Its surface stood like a mirror. It reflected the sky perfectly. At other times a light wind blew, and small lines formed upon the water. The color of the water was never the same. During the floods it grew darker. It turned brown. It carried soil from distant mountains within it. That mud was our wealth. When the Nile flooded, we were not afraid. On the contrary, we were glad, because we knew that when the waters withdrew, life would remain behind. The soil would be soft, seeds would sprout, there would be bread. Children would not go hungry. We believed that the gods had not forgotten us. We said that Hapi, the god of the river, still remembered us. Some mornings I saw fishermen by the shore. Their boats were narrow and long. They moved silently with oars made of reeds. When they cast their nets into the water, they did not speak, as if they were afraid to wake the Nile. Women carried large clay jars on their shoulders. The water inside gently swayed as they walked. As the sun rose higher, the water inside remained cool. Children shaped small balls from mud. They rolled them along the edge of the river. Their laughter did not last long. As the sun climbed higher, everyone grew quiet, because the heat became heavy. As the sun rose, we believed more strongly that Ra was watching us. They said he traveled across the sky in an invisible boat. At night, they said he passed through the underworld and was born again each morning. We watched the sky like a story. Clouds were believed to be the breath of the gods. Stars were told to be the eyes of dead kings. When night came, our village fell silent. Only the sound of insects remained. From afar the howling of jackals could be heard. Their voices echoed across the desert. In those moments death felt close. But we were not afraid, because death was not a dark emptiness to us. It was a long journey. When my father died, the men of the village washed his body. They cleansed him with water from the Nile. Then they wrapped him in linen cloth. Slowly, carefully, I asked my mother why his heart was not removed. She told me that the heart was the true voice of a person. She said that before Osiris, the heart would be weighed against a feather. The feather was light. Sin was heavy. I wanted to believe that my father's heart was light. I imagined him walking in green fields, where there was no thirst, no exhaustion, where the sun did not burn. In our village, the scribes sometimes read the name of the pharaoh aloud. When his name was spoken, everyone fell silent. The pharaoh was believed to be the son of the gods. Even his shadow was considered sacred. We knew that we worked for him, that we paid taxes for him, that soldiers marched for him. But I had never seen him, only his face carved in stone, cold, silent, unchanging. Sometimes I sat by the Nile and looked at the water. I watched its flow. It never hurried as it moved, but it never stopped. Slow, constant, silent, like time. In those days there were no pyramids. Great stones did not yet rise on the horizon, but people were increasing. Villages were growing. Lands were being measured, marked, no longer shared but governed. Other people lived in the north, others lived in the south. There were borders between them, but rumors traveled. They spoke of a day when there would be one king, one crown, one order, one land. At night the voice of the Nile changed. The water that was calm during the day seemed to speak more deeply at night, as if it carried the past and the future together. Sometimes I closed my eyes. I listened to the sound of the water. I breathed in the scent of the soil. I let the wind touch my face. And I thought of those who came before me, of those who would come after. People who would cool their feet in the same water. Faces that would burn under the same sun. Hands that would plant seeds in the same soil. I was only a small part, but this land was vast. This river was ancient. And time continued to flow silently. Chapter 2. The Union of the Two Lands. While I was living by the Nile, I believed the world would always remain the same. The river would flow, the fields would turn green, people would be born and die. Everything would continue in the same silent cycle. But the land was changing, slowly, quietly. Without being noticed, while we plowed our own fields, other people were plowing distant lands. Beyond our village there were other villages in the north. In the south, other people lived. We shared the same Nile, yet we did not know one another. The land felt divided. In the south, narrow valleys stretched between rocks. The river was tight and fast. Winds were harsh. Mountains stood close. People were strong. They were used to heat, hunger, and war. In the north, the Nile widened. It split into branches. Marshlands began. The soil was softer. Villages were crowded. Boats were many. Foreign voices were heard in the markets. We gave names to these two lands, Upper Land, Lower Land. They felt like two different worlds, but the Nile bound them together. Every year its waters flowed from south to north. It carried mud. It carried life. It carried news. Sometimes traders came to our village. They carried salt, copper, linen on their shoulders. Distant names moved on their tongues. They spoke of great markets in the north, of strong warriors in the south. I did not fully understand them, but I felt something approaching. One morning an old man spoke by the river. His voice was thin like the wind. "Soon there will be one king," he said. "He will unite the two lands." I did not understand then. For us, a king was only a face carved in stone. But rumors grew. They said wars had begun in the north. They said spears from the south shone in the sun. A name was whispered, Narmer. Some called him Menes. They said he united the two crowns, the white crown and the red crown, the symbols of the two lands. Slowly rumors became truth. Taxes were collected more regularly. Lands were measured. Borders were drawn. Scribes came to villages. Marks were written on papyrus. New names were carved into stone. The pharaoh was no longer just a king. He had become the order itself. To speak his name was to speak of balance. Some believed the Nile flooded by his breath. Some feared drought came when he was angry. For ordinary people, life remained simple. Fields were plowed. Seeds were planted. Bread was baked. But when we looked at the sky, we felt something new, a weight, a silent fear, and also a strange safety. We heard of a new city, Memphis, between the two lands, where the pharaoh lived, where stone temples rose. We never went there, but we felt its presence, like feeling the sun without seeing it. At night the Nile still flowed. The reeds still whispered in the wind. But the sound of the water had changed. But Egypt was breathing as one body now, like two hearts becoming one, silent, slow, and irreversible. Chapter 3. The Memory of Stone and the Search for Immortality. After Egypt had become a single land, people began to think not only about living, but about being remembered. The Nile was flowing. The fields were turning green. Children were growing in the villages, but the human heart did not want to preserve only today as the soil did. Death was near. It was silent. It was unavoidable, and people did not want this silent journey to disappear. At first, graves were simple. They were pits dug into the sand. Bodies were wrapped in linen, and beside them were placed a few jars, some bread, small belongings. The wind would blow and the sand would slowly cover everything. The sun would rise. The sun would set, and after a while no one would know where anyone lay. But for the pharaohs this was not enough. They were not seen as ordinary humans. They were believed to be the shadows of the gods on earth. Their souls were not meant to disappear. That was when people began to look at stone. Stone was silent. Stone was heavy. Stone did not forget. The first great tombs appeared. Stepped structures, mastabas. Tombs that stood like simple stone houses rising above the ground. People went to the quarries. They cut rock with copper tools. They dragged the blocks on sledges. For months, for years, they worked silently under the sun. No one hurried, because death did not hurry. Scribes wrote measurements. Priests spoke prayers. Masters shaped the stones. Villagers were called one by one. This was not seen as punishment. To work for the pharaoh meant to work for the gods. With every stone that was placed, it was believed that the pharaoh's soul moved a little closer to the sky. There were no pyramids yet, but their shadow had already formed in the minds of people. At night the construction grounds grew silent. The wind passed between the stones. The torches went out. The workers returned to their villages, but the stone remained, cold, silent, shining under the moonlight, as if it were watching time. In those years people learned this. The land could change, kings could die, cities could vanish, but stone would remain, and one day people would decide to build mountains that reached the sky, but that time had not yet come. For now only stone was learning the human, and the human was slowly beginning to resemble the stone, silent, patient, enduring. Chapter 4. The Age of Pyramids. The Old Kingdom. After the two lands were united, Egypt entered a long silence. Wars became rare. Borders grew calm. The Nile flooded regularly. And for the first time in a long while, people believed that tomorrow would not be very different from today. This era later became known as the Old Kingdom. Pharaohs were no longer seen as mere kings. They were considered the order of the gods on earth. Their words became law. Their gaze became destiny. Even their breath was believed to be sacred. People believed that the pharaoh must rule not only in life, but also after death, because order could only continue through him. This belief turned into stone. First tombs grew larger, then they rose higher, then they reached toward the sky. The first stepped structures appeared. Mastabas expanded, and one day, stones were stacked upon stones. Structures whose shadows lasted all day rose from the desert. The pyramids were born. These stone mountains were not only tombs. They were believed to be stairways to the sky for the pharaoh. His soul would reach the stars. He would board the solar boat of Ra. Tens of thousands of workers labored. Farmers were called during the flood season when their fields lay under water. They walked to the quarries. They cut limestone blocks. They dragged them on wooden sledges. They pulled them with ropes. They sweated under the sun. But they were not slaves. They were workers of the state. They received bread. They drank beer. They ate salted fish. And they carried stones for kings whose names they did not know. At Giza, 3 great pyramids rose. Khufu, Khafra, Menkaure. They shone under the sunlight by day. At night they stood like silver under the moon. Travelers lost in the desert found their way by them. But as every stone rose, the state grew heavier. Taxes increased. More grain was taken from the granaries. More men were summoned from villages. Priests multiplied. Temples expanded. Pharaohs grew more distant. From the people, from the soil, from real life. The higher the stone climbed, the longer the shadows grew. And no one yet knew that those shadows would one day cover everything. But the Nile still flowed. The fields still turned green. And people, living under the shadows of stone mountains, believed that order would last forever. Chapter 5. Collapse and the First Intermediate Period. The shadows of the pyramids were long. Stone mountains stood silently over the desert, but behind them, the heart of the land was slowly beginning to crack. For many years the pharaohs had been strong. Taxes were collected. Granaries were full. Canals were maintained. But time was as patient as stone, and human order was not as strong as stone. Some years the Nile flooded late. Some years it did not flood at all. When the waters withdrew, the soil hardened. Seeds did not sprout. Bread became scarce. The doors of the granaries were opened more often. Then they began to open to emptiness. Hunger arrived quietly, first in villages, then in towns, then in cities. People spoke less. Voices faded in the markets. Offerings left at temples became fewer. Priests lengthened their prayers. But the sky did not answer. The pharaohs grew distant. Palaces separated from the people. Taxes increased. But order decreased. Local governors grew powerful. Each began to act like a king of his own land. Soldiers no longer marched for the pharaoh. They marched for their local rulers. Laws changed from region to region. What was justice in one place was a crime in another. Tombs began to be robbed. Even the pyramids were no longer safe. The belongings of the dead were stolen. Mummies were opened. It was as if the order of the gods had broken. People became afraid, because even the world after death was no longer safe. For the first time, dark words appeared in ancient writings. The poor have become rich. The rich have become hungry. Order has been reversed. The scribes wrote, this period later became known as the First Intermediate Period. Because Egypt was no longer one body, it had broken into pieces. Different kings ruled in the north, different dynasties in the south. The Nile still flowed, but the land did not flow in the same direction. This chaos lasted for many years. A generation was born, grew old, and died, without seeing order return. But the land had memory. The Nile had patience. People had patience. And one day, in a quiet city in the south, the seed of a new order would be planted. Chapter 6. Rebirth in the Middle Kingdom. Extended. The years of drought slowly faded into the past. The Nile rose again. Water spread across the floodplains. Cracked earth softened. Hard layers broke apart, and green shoots quietly rose from the mud. The land was breathing again. After a long time, people began to look at their fields with hope. But this hope was cautious, because everyone remembered the hunger, the empty granaries, the dried canals, the abandoned villages, and people turning against one another. The country was not yet fully healed. Different rulers governed the north. Other kings ruled the south. Each region raised its own soldiers, collected its own taxes, and enforced its own justice. But this divided order weighed heavily on Egypt, because Egypt was strong when it was whole, and fragile when it was divided. It was during this time that a man rose in the south, in a city called Thebes. His name was Mentuhotep. He was quiet. He disliked display, but he was patient. And patience was the strongest weapon of this age. First he united the small cities around him, then neighboring regions, then lands farther away, sometimes through words, sometimes through waiting, sometimes through war. He slowly built his army. He marched along the Nile. In every city he restored order. In every village he reorganized taxes. In every temple he negotiated with the priests. This reunification did not happen in a single day. It took years. But at last the north bowed, and the two lands became one again. This era became known as the Middle Kingdom. A new idea of the state was born. The pharaoh was no longer only the shadow of the gods on earth. He was also a ruler responsible for holding the country together. He had to deliver justice. He had to prevent hunger. He had to keep the canals open. He had to fill the granaries. For this reason the state system was rebuilt. The power of local governors was limited. Taxes were recorded in writing. The number of scribes increased. Grain stores came under state control. Irrigation canals were repaired. New canals were dug. The floods of the Nile were now guided more carefully. Agriculture flourished again. Trade also expanded during this age. Gold arrived from Nubia in the south. Lapis lazuli came from the east. Cedar wood was brought from the north. As boats drifted slowly along the Nile, storehouses filled once more. But this prosperity was quiet. There was little display. Pyramids were no longer built. Giant monuments were not raised. Instead, rock-cut tombs were carved for kings. Simple, silent. Even statues changed. Kings were no longer shown as perfect young figures. Their eyes were tired, their cheeks hollow, as if even stone was saying, "Power is a heavy burden." The people had changed as well. They watched their rulers more carefully. They asked where the taxes went. They spoke of why granaries were full or empty. Egypt was growing. Chapter 7. The Rise of the Empire, the New Kingdom. After Egypt stood up again, the silence slowly faded. The Nile flowed regularly. The granaries were full. Roads became crowded. Along the paths stretching from villages to cities, not only farmers walked now, but soldiers as well. The land was breathing again, but this breath was stronger, more determined, wider. The kings seated in Thebes turned their eyes beyond the horizon. Protecting the land was no longer enough. Power had to be shown. Borders had to be pushed outward. Armies were rebuilt. Bronze swords were forged. War chariots were made. Horses were trained. Shields shone under the sun. Soldiers lined up along the Nile, marching south to north, north to east. In this age, Egypt was no longer just a country. It was becoming an empire. Gold came from Nubia. Cedar wood was brought from Lebanon. Spices arrived from distant lands. Temples grew larger. Walls rose higher. The name of the god Amun echoed everywhere. And then something unusual happened. A woman sat on the throne. Hatshepsut. She wore the crown of a pharaoh. She even had a false beard made. But her voice was gentle. Her rule was quiet. During her time, wars became fewer. Ships multiplied. Trade routes opened. Expeditions were sent to the land of Punt. Gold, ivory, and incense were brought back. Temples carried her name. Her face was carved into stone. But death always came. Hatshepsut fell silent. After her, kings took up the sword again. Seti came. He marched to reclaim the borders. He destroyed fortresses. He subdued cities. Then his son came. Ramesses, tall, powerful. A king who carved his name into stone. He built temples. He carved his statues into mountains. He had his battles written on walls. Armies clashed at Kadesh. The earth trembled. The sky filled with dust. Ramesses saw himself close to the gods. So did the people. In his time, Egypt reached its widest borders. Wealth flowed. Grain overflowed. Temples were decorated with gold. But like all power, this too slowly grew tired. Armies faded in distant lands. Taxes grew heavy. Priests became strong. Pharaohs became lonely. But people did not know this yet. They only saw this. The Nile was flowing. The sun was rising. Temples were standing tall. And Egypt seemed to stand at the center of the world. Chapter 8, Daily Life, Faith, and Order. While the empire expanded, cities grew, and armies marched to distant lands, the true heart of Egypt beat in quiet places, in the fields, in the workshops, in the dim rooms of small houses. As the Nile flooded each year, people learned to live by its rhythm. They shaped their calendar by the water. Time to plant, time to harvest, time to rest. All followed the breath of the river. Farmers rose before sunrise. They carried wooden plows on their shoulders and walked slowly behind oxen. Mud clung to their feet. The sun burned their backs. But they did not stop, because the Nile did not stop. In the cities, another life flowed. Stone workers carved temple walls. Sculptors shaped the faces of gods from stone. Carpenters built chests. Weavers pulled linen into fine threads. Scribes sat in the shade, reed pens in their hands. They wrote numbers on papyrus scrolls. They recorded taxes. They measured grain. They wrote people's names. Writing meant power. Few could read. Even fewer could write. And everyone knew it. Life inside homes was simple. Clay jars, reed beds, a small statue of a god in the corner. In the evenings, families sat on the ground, broke barley bread, ate onions, and drank beer. Even children drank beer. Water was not always safe, but belief was everywhere. There was a small prayer at every doorway. A protective god was imagined in every field. The gods were called at every birth. The name of Osiris was whispered at every death. People believed the heart was sacred because the heart thought, the heart remembered. The heart carried sin. It would be weighed against a feather in the next world. That was why bodies were mummified. Organs were removed, but the heart was left inside, because the essence of a person lived there. Children began to work early. Girls wove cloth with their mothers. Boys went to the fields. A few became scribes. Very few became priests. Almost none became pharaoh. The pharaoh was a distant shadow. Yet he was everywhere. His name was written in temples. His face was on walls. Oaths were sworn in his name. Wars were fought for him. Grain was collected for him. People believed the pharaoh was the order of the gods on earth. If he stood, the world was balanced. If he fell, chaos would come. So people feared quietly. At night, oil lamps burned inside homes. The wind moved through the reeds. The Nile flowed slowly, and people slept, knowing they would wake to the same day again, step on the same soil, sweat under the same sun, and look to the same gods. Chapter 9: Foreign Rule and the Last Pharaohs. The glory of the new kingdom slowly faded. Great armies were no longer as large. Tribute from distant lands decreased. Golden roads closed. Borders quietly shrank. Temples still rose toward the sky, but the voices inside them grew fewer. Priests spoke less. The gods seemed to answer less. The Nile continued to flow, but the heart of the world began to beat elsewhere. First came the Assyrians from the northeast. They carried iron weapons. Their faces were hard. They besieged cities. When they entered Egyptian lands, villages fell silent. Doors closed. People withdrew into their homes. Pharaohs still sat on their thrones, but they were no longer alone. After a time the Assyrians left, but then came the Persians. From the east, from a vast empire, the sound of their horses echoed in the deserts. When Persian kings entered Egypt, they called themselves pharaohs. They wore the crown. They made offerings to the temples. But their hearts did not belong to this land. They raised taxes. They gathered gold. They loaded grain onto ships. Egypt became only a part of a great empire. The people tried to accept this. Fields were still plowed. The Nile still flooded. But freedom became only a memory. Then one day a young king came from the west. His name was Alexander. He was barely in his 20s, but behind him marched thousands of soldiers. As his army crossed the desert, the sandstorms seemed to fall silent. Egyptian cities opened their gates without a fight. Alexander went to the temples. The priests of Amun declared him the son of the gods. He considered himself a pharaoh, but he did not stay long. He died young. He left behind a divided empire, and Egypt passed into the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy. Thus began a Greek dynasty. Memphis was no longer the capital. A new city rose, Alexandria. Great harbors were built. A lighthouse reached into the sky. Ships came from every corner of the world. A library was founded. It held thousands of scrolls. Greek philosophers arrived. Scholars debated. Maps were drawn. Stars were measured. But in the villages life remained unchanged. People still worked along the Nile. They prayed to the old gods. They wrapped their dead in linen. They kept their hearts to be weighed before Osiris. Greek kings carried the title of pharaoh, but the people never fully saw them as Egyptian. The last great name was Cleopatra. She was intelligent, educated. She spoke many languages. She even learned the Egyptian tongue. She could speak to the people, but she was alone. Rome was rising. Its shadow fell across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra allied herself with Rome, first with Caesar, then with Antony. But Rome did not forgive. In the final war, Cleopatra was defeated, and Egypt became a province of Rome. Pharaonic rule ended. Chapter 10. The silent end and the flow of time. the withdrawal of ancient Egypt from history. After Roman rule began, life in Egypt seemed to continue from the outside. The Nile still flooded, the fields still turned green. Children were born in villages, people grew old, and the dead were buried. But the soul of the land had changed. The pharaohs were gone. They were replaced by governors sent from Rome. Laws were written in distant cities, and taxes were carried across the Mediterranean. The temples still stood, but they were no longer crowded. The number of priests declined each year. The last people who could read hieroglyphs grew old. New generations no longer knew the ancient prayers. Isis, Osiris, Ara. Their names remained on stone, but slowly faded from human voices. New beliefs arrived in time, first the Greek gods, then the Roman gods, and later religions of one god. The doors of the temples closed one by one. Some were turned into churches, some were abandoned. Some were buried under sand. One day, hieroglyphic writing became completely unreadable. The stones fell silent. Egypt was no longer the center of a civilization. It had become an ordinary province of Rome. But the Nile did not change. It flooded every year. It left its mud. It fed the soil. Silently. Centuries passed. Cities collapsed. Temples fell, statues were overturned, sand covered everything, and people forgot, until thousands of years later others came and learned to read the stones again. But by then, ancient Egypt had already fallen asleep, into a deep sleep, a silent sleep, a timeless sleep, because the river was still flowing, the land was still there, and time, as always, continued to flow.